why should you study church history? Today in Life Talks, we're going to be answering that question. I don't know about you, but I absolutely love studying history because I think the stories of history are truly, truth is stranger than fiction sometimes, right? I'm Ben. I'm the lead pastor here at Life Fellowship. I'm here with Josh, our producer. This is another episode of Life Talks. Dan, I don't know where Dan is today, but he's doing something else besides recording with us. No, he's very busy. He's a very busy man.
Sure, he's doing something.
Yeah, so I know we're in the series on kind of socially acceptable sins. We'll get back to that, but
give us a break. We're all convicted enough right now. Can we just do something?
We had these we just talked about lust, and it's just like, oh man, let's move on to something else. But there's this.
Now we're going to talk about how you haven't been studying your church fathers.
But I think church history is. I didn't really study it until I was out of seminary.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Out of seminary.
I had one church, let me just reframe that. I had one church history class in seminary that I loved. But it was, one class, and it really kind of piqued my interest because I think for me in the church tradition I grew up in, which was Baptist, they didn't really care about church history. It was like church history began when your church started. That's all they really cared about. And I'm like,
that's funny.
I don't think that's what we should care about. And I think a lot of times, especially the free church movement, we're very uncomfortable with studying church history because the intertwinings of Catholicism, Roman Catholics, Orthodox Church, we're kind of like, well, where did the real church began? And then you got the Reformation, and so a lot of those denominations like the Presbyterians and some of these other groups came out of that, right? And so, but I think a lot of times, most Presbyterians would say they start studying church history around 1517, and nothing exists before then.
Right.
But really, I have found that when you study church history, it is a fascinating topic, and you will learn so much about the faith and so much about God and so much about humanity. And so to me, it will enrich your faith when you study church history. I think a lot of times people are like, why are there so many denominations? Well, study church history.
You'll find out.
There's a reason why we have so many denominations. We'll have so I think there's some. I know I'm bringing this just hit me out of thin air, but I can't remember if this was actually part of a podcast that Dan and I talked about, but it might have been after we recorded one day, but I think we talked about, someone asked the question, are there any popes in heaven? Was that during a recording?
I've not been here for this.
Okay, so I think one of the conversations was, do you think there's any popes in heaven? And I said, yeah, I think there's some popes in heaven. And Dan was like, no way. And I'm just like, well, you got to remember, the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church that you know of today was not always the Roman Catholic Church of 1,500 years ago, right? And I think a lot of times what we realize is by studying church history, you realize there have been these movements throughout history over 2,000 years. Even within something we would call Roman Catholicism or the Catholic Church, that were movements of God. Okay, that makes us outside of the Roman Catholic Church feel very weird. But we have to remember we were all part of the same kind of root system. We all traveled out, in that root system. But eventually, the Reformation kind of broke away, and then some groups broke out of that tradition, and so there's kind of like this. There used to be this giant oak tree and split in two, and then it kind of split into...
Big split in 1050 something,
yeah, right?
Yeah. There's the huge schism.
The huge schism between the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholic Church. And then the Reformation was another branch, and then it was like... And then it just kind of... Now there are literally hundreds of branches. So, but I think I'm going to give you a couple reasons why I think you should study church history. I think everyone should study church history. First reason is worship. I think when you study church history, look for God. You have to look for the movements of God. And what you will see is you'll see God's faithfulness because he's always faithful to his church. You'll see God's patience because you're like, God, I can't believe you put up with these people for so long, right? You also see his power. You see the movements of the Spirit and you're like, wow, God did that. It wasn't man, it was God. And so you see the character and the nature of God lived out in a beautiful way in church history. And so that's the number one reason I think you should study church history is because it will help you worship God more. Number two, I think studying church history will help increase your discernment in life. What I mean by that is when you read church history, you see all the mistakes people made. You see all the man-made movements as much as you see the God movements. You see what men do to corrupt the church. Like there's this, when you, especially in the Middle Ages, when you're reading what people are saying and doing and the corruption of the priesthood in the Middle Ages and then the papal schism of the 13th century and all of just the junk and the garbage and all this stuff that's going on, and you're like, where's God in this? And I think it reminds you that it is very natural for people to use institutions like the church for their own personal gain.
Yes.
And so discernment of people, discernment of motivations of leaders, but I also think discernment of theology. There's not one theological problem that the church is facing today that has not faced scores of times over 2,000 years. And what you've got to learn is, okay, what happened when the church was facing a problem about the nature of Jesus or narcissistic leaders or, all these things. Like when you study church history, you learn that there are so many different things that the church has faced that problem before. Learn from the playbook of how the church has maintained or how they responded, or learn from what they did wrong. You know what I'm saying? Like I think all of us could say the church executing people is a really bad idea.
Yeah, I've been wanting to bring this up.
It's not only a bad idea, it's unbiblical, right? So
talk about that because
it's a whole other podcast, right?
Oh man, okay.
But the reality is there are things that people have done or things that people believe, and you're thinking, how'd you get there?
Yeah,
and the discernment of when people strayed from, I know this is a Reformation term, from sola scriptura, the Word of God being the sole authority of our faith and practice, people got into trouble.
Yeah.
And that's why the Reformation happened, because there was a elevation of the authority of the traditions of the church, or the elevation of a position within the church, the Pope, that finally people were like, wait a second, when I read the Bible, this doesn't say this. And that's what the Reformation was all about. But there were moments. Now they were called conciliatory movements. I forget the exact term. I think that's what they were called. But there were a dozen of those, anywhere between 500 and 1500 AD. There were a dozen of these movements. You would see these popes come, or these people, show up out of nowhere and saying, we got to get back to what they would call primitive Christianity. What they're saying is, we got to get back to the Bible. And eventually all these groups, you'd see these movements for maybe a few decades, even up to 100 years. And what would happen? The Roman Catholic Church would swallow it. They would swallow it, squelch it, consume it, corporatize it.
Yeah.
But you would keep seeing this over. It's not like I think many Christians, like, we read our Bibles, we get to the end we read the book of Acts. We're like, I know some things happened with Constantine, and then the Reformation happened. You're like,
yeah.
Well, what happened for 1,200 years?
Yeah, that's pretty much me. I don't know what happened.
And so you reading and studying those movements within that time frame, again, it helps educate you. And that was my next one. It educates. It teaches us educationally. I think it teaches us what is cultural and what is transcendent. When you learn and see there are certain things that were normal for churches at certain time periods and certain ages and certain groups. And you're like, well, why don't we do that today? Well, maybe it's because it's just a different culture. And you learn that there are certain things that we do that are cultural, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with contextualizing the gospel and the church to fit a context that's like, okay, we're taking the things that are kind of squishy and just saying this is how we're going to do it in our culture.
Yeah.
But it also teaches what the transcendent truths of God's word, the transcendent truths of the church, and saying, this is the way we're going to do it. Like, I think if you and I went to a church service, let's just say during the 300s, in the city of Rome, we would be like, what's going on right now?
And imagine them watching our service.
Yeah, and imagine them joining,
our Easter service.
Sometimes I wonder what Paul would have thought. We invite Paul, and Paul's like, what are you guys doing? You know what I mean? And again, it doesn't mean that what you're doing is bad. It just means there's context and
there's cultural
differences. And so I think studying church history will give you a greater appreciation of what is cultural.
Yeah.
And when you do that, all of a sudden people's like willing to stand on these hills to die on that are cultural, how we do things, they become less important.
Yeah, but then there's also this really cool thing, though, I would think, where the longer in history, not only are you going to be able to more easily see what is transcendent versus what is not, just because of how time works, but you're also going to have, you can kind of get the best of a lot of different cultures.
Yes.
When I started traveling to other countries doing, whether it was pro-life or Christian kind of work, it was like, these are my brothers and sisters here. Like, I'm the typical American with tunnel vision on, just kind of looking at us. But like, I have brothers and sisters in all these different places, and there's kind of interesting cultural differences. But you go to church services around different, countries, it's really different.
Yes. And even in America, like I love going. I've gone to a number of different Black church services.
They worship better than
everyone. It's a completely different experience. And there's times I'm like, oh, I would love to bring this to where I'm at. Right. I remember worshiping in the Dominican Republic one time and just seeing the worship service there, and they're like, these people don't tire. And they would, they literally gather to worship for hours, and they just, with the joy, and you're like, we don't have this.
We did a church service. I led worship at a church in Belgium where they had a room at the top. It was like the United Nations with translators. They were translating into 5 different languages. I was like, this feels a little bit like heaven right here. Yeah. Like we're doing worship songs.
Yep.
And people are singing Farsi.
Yeah.
This is kind of
that's so cool.
I just want like there's just a lot of good things that we can learn from other cultures and countries. I know we're going to be doing like the VR thing at some point.
Yes.
Like, I love that for that reason. We can get that from church history too.
So I think you learn there's an education to it to church history. Another reason I believe is inspiration. I mean, Josh, I can't tell you how many times reading stories of certain figures in church history, John Huss, Adoniram Judson, even Martin Luther, who I don't think I would have been Martin Luther's friend. I always find like people that are like, I love Martin Luther. I'm like, I don't think you, but I do. What I admire about Luther was, it's like God raised this man up there needed to be a strong person who's willing to stand up to the Pope.
It needed to be very, very bold person.
And God used that boldness, right? And I remember going to Worms, the city of Worms, where he had that moment where he stands, and he defends himself, and he makes that very famous statement, "Here I stand, unless you can convince me otherwise, by reason or by scriptures." And what they have in that, the church building is gone, but they have this platform and they have plaques around the floor of where things were in that moment. But what I love about in that place, where they have these bronze shoes, and they're massive, and it's the exact location where Martin Luther stood. And the reason why the shoes are big is you slip your feet into them.
No.
And you stand where Martin Luther stood.
Wow.
And they have the saying that he said in that moment. And you're like, it just gives you these goosebumps.
Wow.
Like, this is where he stood, and he stood up for the gospel, and he said, for scripture. And you're like, wow.
Yeah. Wow.
And those are the kinds of inspirational moments that you want to have.
Yeah, it's the other side of the coin of the horrible people in church history, full of church history.
And you see how God used ordinary people through, and you see the courage, and you see the conviction. I mean, this is one of the reasons we're taking a trip in August and September this year. I'm leading a group over there because I want to teach them about some of these men like John Huss, men like Martin Luther, men like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, people that were tested in their faith and stood that test and passed that test. And another book I've referenced multiple times in sermons and podcasts, The Insanity of God. That's more of the history of the last maybe 50, 60 years, but it goes behind the Iron Curtain. What was faith like there? And so I think, man, there's something about the stories of Christians in church history that are inspiring.
Yeah.
And I think that we would do ourselves, we do ourselves a disservice when we don't really read and study these people, these movements. Like I love reading about, I was really into the Anabaptist movement years ago, studying how the Anabaptists were different than the Reformers. And because what the Reformers did was they basically took the doctrines of soteriology and rescued it from the Catholic Church. What they never applied though the Bible to their ecclesiology. That's what the Anabaptists did. They were like, wait a second, let's apply the Word of God. If sola scriptura is true, apply it to the church.
Right.
All these priests, the hierarchy and the structure. Like, anyways, I love reading. So inspiration, I think, is really important. I think another thing that we learn is just gratitude. You learn gratitude for what we have, and you learn there's this understanding of also desire of saying there's certain things we've lost. Like there's something about seeing sometimes the reverence. I love going into Gothic cathedrals and seeing how architecture reflected theology.
Yeah. It's art.
And I think there's something that we've talked a little bit about that here, how, our buildings today are a reflection of, we want everyone to feel comfortable. And I'm like, well, maybe we should have buildings that make us feel like we are in a sacred space. Like what's wrong with that? Right?
Yeah.
So I think the other thing I would say is it challenges our faith and it deepens our faith. I just got back from Italy. I went to Florence. I went to the Uffizi Museum, and if you go to the Uffizi, it's one of the greatest collections of Renaissance art. And when you study, here's what's so fascinating. I'm so excited to look. I love art. I love fine art.
I didn't know that.
It's one of my favorite things to go. I was hooked in college when I went to the Frick Museum, which is in New York City, one of the greatest collections of fine art, and I just was captivated by the beauty of art. And so when we go to London or I love going to these museums.
Yeah.
So went to the Uffizi, and so all of these amazing works done by all these Renaissance artists. And one of the things that stood out to me was you basically have 90% of the paintings, and there are scores of these paintings, but 90% of these paintings are of 3 scenes. Or four scenes. 4 scenes.
Okay, wait. Is it Madonna and the Baby?
Madonna and the Baby.
Okay, let's see the crucifixion.
The crucifixion of Jesus on the cross.
Yep. I don't know if I'm going to get the other 2.
The other 2 happen right.
Adam and Eve.
Nope. The other one is the angel announcing to Mary, and the other one was Jesus taken off the cross.
Okay, well, I put those 2 together.
But those 4 scenes alone,
that's it.
90% of the biblical art. What does it tell you? It tells you their theology was so narrow.
Yeah.
Like their entire understanding of the biblical story and the gospel and the narrative, it was so truncated into these 4 scenes. And I'm thinking,
all
right, so I see that and I'm it bothers me. I'm like, man, they were so lost. They were so, because this art reflects their theology.
Yeah.
But then again, Josh, what it makes me do is it says, okay, how are we doing the same thing today?
Yeah. Yeah.
What do we do?
Yeah.
So like, for example, I think what we find in our art today is, and we might not paint these things, but it's a reflection of our sermon series, and it's a reflection of our worship songs, but it's really, we've taken a part of the Christian faith, which is very important. I don't want to minimize this, but it's our experience with God and what God does to make me feel better. And we have made that the major theme of everything. And if we're not careful, it's almost like God is there to serve me and make my life great, as opposed to where are the songs that are capturing the holiness of God, the transcendence of God, the power of God. Like it is all about us. It's all about me, how I feel. It's very, and again, I'm not saying we shouldn't sing spiritual songs about what God has done for me.
Right. But it shouldn't be just that.
But we have a very limited expression of our faith today.
Yeah.
And I think that's these kinds of things, studying church history, reveal the ways in which we're missing it. So
I've got a couple of questions.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about the common, I think, misunderstanding that people have that I imagine might actually be one of the smaller maybe factors that reasons why people sometimes don't study church history. Talk about the common view that, once we get past like 100 years ago, it's a lot of like dumb shepherds. You know what I mean? Like it's like, they couldn't be as intelligent because they weren't in the modern times. Can you talk a little bit about,
I think I do believe you have to, there are certain people that don't care about history.
Yes.
And I know some people are listening to this and but I'm just not going to listen to it.
They didn't get this far though, so we're not talking to you.
But I think that what you have to understand is that, those people are smarter, if not, more brilliant than we are.
Yeah.
I would, again, I don't agree with all this man's theology, but I think you'll be hard pressed to find one of the most intellectually gifted individuals in the history of the church was Thomas Aquinas. If you do not read and study Thomas Aquinas, you're missing out.
Yeah.
Even though I'm not Catholic and I don't agree, I don't espouse with a lot of things he does, but he has helped me to think about things better because of his brilliance.
And that's what matters. It doesn't matter so much that get the good things out of it that only someone with that gift that God gave him could give us. That's exactly what we do.
So really quickly, I'm going to give everybody some just really quick resources. If you want to get into church history, here's what I would say to start. And I'm going to start with you people who don't read. Okay, I'm gonna give.
I love this.
We're gonna go to like we're ankle deep in the water.
Okay, we need to do links in the description. Chad, links in the description for this. We're gonna make this as easy as possible for people.
So the first thing is there's a podcast called 5 Minutes in Church History with Stephen Nichols. Okay, 5 Minutes in Church History. He does a phenomenal job, and he really covers a lot of things from modern church history to Reformation church history to ancient church history to, he goes all over the place. And it's very well done. He doesn't do everything in order. He'll have these little tiny mini series, but he's all over the place. So don't look for, this is not a chronological thing.
Yeah.
Just know that. Yeah. You're going to get these bits and pieces, but it's very helpful.
That's what a lot of people want anyway.
The other one, there's a podcast called History of the Christian Church by Lance Ralston. History of the Christian Church by Lance Ralston. He is a pastor out in California. I think he pastored like a Calvary Chapel church out there. But he does these 20-minute episodes of church history that are very general, high, flyover, doesn't get in the weeds, very easy to listen to, very easy to explain. He gives you the highlights. I think he does a phenomenal job of doing church history, especially what I would say is early church history up to the Reformation. Once you get to the Reformation, again, the tree kind of splits out, and it's really hard to kind of do that well. But that podcast is phenomenal. He also has a mini series within this. It's like a 10-part series on how the world changed with the advent of the church, and he goes through like women's rights, healthcare, education. When you realize he kind of does these overviews of saying, this is what healthcare was like before the church. This is what it's like now.
Oh yeah. The church brought women's
so
rights.
that you can understand, understand your history.
Yeah.
That the things that we have today that we enjoyed it is because of the Western church. 2 books really quickly. Church History in Plain Language, Bruce Shelley. It's a 1-volume. He does a phenomenal job. It's pretty thick. It's about 500 or 600 pages. But it is very readable. It truly is church history in plain language. It's not super academic. The chapters are short enough that you can enjoy them. It goes in chronological order.
Right.
But that's probably my for everyone, church history for everyone. That's what I would say.
Right. And it's long, but there's just been a lot of history. These are bite-sized.
They're bite-sized. You don't have to sit there and make sure you're reading every single chapter day by day.
Yeah.
The second resources. It's called The Story of Christianity, 2-volume set by Justo Gonzalez, The Story of Christianity. The first volume goes from the apostles to the Reformation, and then the second volume is the Reformation to modern times. So both of those volumes are really, really well done. So if you want to get into church history from a 5-minute podcast to a 2-volume set, that's what I would point you to.
You've got everything. You're covered.
You're covered.
You're covered.
Yeah. So anyways, I hope you'll take this challenge to this year, dig a little bit into church history. It will challenge your faith. It will deepen your faith. It will help you appreciate and worship God even more. So this has been another episode of Life Talks. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll talk to you next time.